Hello, and welcome to this concise guide of the great man's tome. I was a Dalibor student, 88 to 89, the year in which the studio project is the one which features on the cover of the book, together with a number of colleagues who went on to highly successful eminence in architectural education. As you can see, architecture was not such a lucrative endeavour for me. Architecture brought me here to Kenya, where I now live in rural bliss, in an eco house, which you can see here made of mud. Over the years, I have continued to read bits of Peter's and Dalibor's extensive reading lists, which will feature in this guide. Just to note that the title In the Shadow of Production has slightly ominous connotations. I think it's fair to say that he means the shadow of Henry Ford. Production casts its rather sinister shadow over creativity. It is not necessary to look deep or far into the past to recover such memories. Indeed, it isn't. The city is a palimpsest of a range of eras stretching back in time, apart from the very modern cities like Brasilia or Canberra. And one of the best ways of understanding how life was lived is the central question for an architect to grasp. No better put than in Peter Carl's essay for the Cambridge Archaeological Journal, Were Cities Built as Images? Such planned cities necessarily incorporate an essential tension between praxis, the practical day-to-day needs of the urban community, and idealism, the desire to impose on those practical concerns a city plan which expresses a symbolic or cosmological image. It's perhaps difficult, or perhaps we're just too lazy to imagine the ceremonial and ritual calendar of the ancient city and its hierarchy from house of the citizenry through to public institutions and ultimately to the house of God, the temple where the king, as the anointed representative, is established. And Peter's essay goes on and gives a fantastic argument and explains the relationship between the geometry, if you like, the cosmic geometry, whether the geometry was imposed on the city, in other words, which came first, the geometry or life of the city. And it's quite clear that typically that the life of the city establishes through its heuristic iterations a pattern that might reflect or be contrived to reflect the cosmic order. In the case of Priene, we know, and Miletus, one of the first known gridded cities, but generally, as we look at these other examples, that there is an order in all cultures, that the configuration of the topography is fundamentally human, not mathematical. To illustrate better the understanding of praxis, Peter draws an analogy with making things, the craft of making, and the technology of making. In other words, praxis and techne. He gives the example of shoes, and he says, since praxis addresses the continuity between the making of shoes or temples and the speculative activity for which explicit symbols are the vehicle, one might expect that it would be the common denominator in the interpretation of cities. Instead, it is commonly suppressed or taken for granted. It seems to fall between the symbolist's top-down interpretation and the morpho-functionalist's bottom-up interpretation. Whilst everyone pays lip service to complexity, there is a natural conflict between the methodological requirements of epistemological clarity and the comparative messiness of the practical order. Accordingly, the theme of city image illuminates a more general possibility that overdependence upon conceptual categories, material or symbolic, induces an ontological blindness. The rather narrow contemporary vision of architecture as a discipline that can be treated as an instrument or as a commodity is the result of the transformation of the broadly oriented art of building into a separate profession, judged mostly by the criteria of technical discipline. In both cases, the work produced falls short of the required conditions and the true possibilities of the task. Even the most elaborate systems or most successful personal visions cannot replace the unity of the different levels of knowledge required for genuine creativity. Attempts to come to terms with this force architects to sacrifice all aspects of architecture that do not meet the standards of technical knowledge, and where possible to compensate for that sacrifice by cultivating personal experiences and visions on the periphery, or by accepting silently the instrumental operations of the current official culture. One of his fundamental points here, there are two. First is the notion of the cosmology. Because architecture is public and it is shared, just as the heavens are, we can't privately own a piece of the ecliptic plane and put a fence around it. It is inevitably, unlike on the ground where we can put walls and make things private, the heavens are shareable, and in that shareability is embodied all kinds of ethical symbols and time clocks and devices and navigation devices. And so the cosmos must be shared, and therefore any ethical overlay is shareable too. Architecture must be shareable. Architecture must be human. The drama of this cosmic landscape and its daily cycle is mythically represented. Thorkild Jacobsen gives a fabulous account of the sun god sailing through the heavens in his boat from east to west. Light which rises in the east, the Oriens lux, the light of knowledge and wisdom, which then sets or dies in the west on a daily basis and is then shadowed by the lunar orb and the pantheon of stars and constellations that come out at night. This drama of death and return is also embodied in myths. Isis and Osiris, seasonal return of the Nile waters and the Euphrates, similarly, and is elucidated by Mircea Eliade in the fantastic work called The Myth of Eternal Return. It morphs into Dionysus and ultimately into Jesus' resurrection. But it is represented in our life and the life of things and the life of the garden. And this is the crucial point, that the garden dramatizes that cycle in a similar way. Things grow, things die, they return to the soil.
The venerable word human means etymologically from the soil and shares the same root with humus, the soil. Remember that you are dust, and to dust you will return.
Things which grow we can eat, and they're put on a table made of wood which was alive, and there's a whole alchemy therefore behind that imagery. But that cosmic order and its transposition on earth was the fascination of the power of nature and its vanquisher, the natura naturans and the natura naturata, which Shakespeare gives us. What piece of work is a man, the paragon of animals, this quintessence of dust? The second is his notion of vertical history, that march of technology and progress hasn't really changed the way we live very much. We get up in the morning, we have a cup of coffee, we get married, we have funerals, we have children, they have birthdays, they have parties, we have parties in our house, outside our house, in small groups, in large groups. We have public encounters. We sit on chairs, and that really hasn't changed an awful lot in the last 10,000 years. So the house, or dwelling rather, is unchanged by technology. The structure of situations is metaphorical, and the examples that he gave us, you can read in the toilet and you can read in the library, you can read on a train. The matter of reading, if we left it to the technocrats, you would only be allowed to read in a library because the library is for reading. Why would you be reading on a train? Ditto that the room that you're sitting in right now, if it's a house of any age, someone might have given birth in the room that you are sitting in right now listening to me here. Someone might have died in that room. You may have children in your room that you are in right now in the future. The temporal imagination that the architecture can embody is really only limited by your own imagination. You can change the wallpaper, but you can't change, you won't unless you demolish. Of course, that's what Haussmann does in Paris, demolishes and Hitler in Berlin attempted to, and in fact all the colonial powers here in Nairobi. The 1948 plan for a colonial capital is modelled on Pennsylvania Avenue and the Capitol in Washington. We're looking into the past. The first thing we find is Vitruvius. And I want to digress and turn to Jeremy Till's commentary, Book 1, The Premium, talking to Caesar. But when I saw that you were giving your attention not only to the welfare of society in general and to the establishment of public order, but also to the providing of public buildings intended for utilitarian purposes, so that not only should the state have been enriched with provinces by your means, but that the greatness of its power might likewise be attended with distinguished authority in its public buildings. Jeremy Till talks about in collected writings, Modernity and Order. Public buildings were to provide eminent guarantees for the majesty of empire. What is happening here is that under the more or less benign cloak of aesthetic codes, Vitruvius is slipping in a distinctly non-benign association with social reform and imperial power. The term ordering all too easily conflates the visual with the political. Just because he was first does not necessarily make him right, but it certainly makes Vitruvius influential, because the mistaken and dangerous conflation of visual order with social order continues to this day. And then delving into Freudian interpretation of that social order and its moral purity, Sigmund Freud famously identifies beauty, cleanliness, and order as occupying a special position among the requirements of civilization. We have just identified the combination of beauty and order in the Vitruvian legacy. Cleanliness adds another dimension. It denotes purity, the removal of waste, whiteness. And it is not for nothing that this cleanliness is so often associated with some kind of moral order made possible by the architect.
Yes, sir, Chaplain Gill, but since neither one of us are God, I don't think either one of us are in any position to say who's good and who's evil.
Why don't you just ask your question?
We were discussing the disciples. What color were they?
Well, I don't think we know that for certain.
But they were Hebrews, were they not?
That's right.
What color were the original Hebrews?
I have told you that we don't know that for certain.
Then you can't believe for certain that Jesus was white.
God is white. Isn't it obvious?
That it is clear that the ordering tendencies of architectural modernism elide the ordering tendencies of modernity. There are two main sites where this happens. First is through the international style of corporate modernism, and secondly through the architecture of the welfare state. Importantly, it needs to be seen that the poor have been reordered, and it is here that architectural modernism comes in as a signifier of order, cleanliness, and progress.
Contrary to what they often say of themselves, modernists are not forward-looking, but almost exclusively backward-looking creatures. It seems that their vision of the future has blinded them to where they were going, or rather, as if what they meant by the future was entirely made of rejected past, without any realistic content about things to come.
Jeremy Till elsewhere is insistent that there is no architecture without politics, and architects who refuse to acknowledge that it is a benign aesthetic hobby are, apart from fooling themselves, they're also fooling the public with all the social segregation, social cleansing, and destruction of the public realm and social interaction that goes with that, as we've seen in London and all over the UK, but far less in Europe. But it's happening. The Knight Franks, the vultures of corporate real estate. It's a global business, and it's highly connected with money laundering, but they get away with it, and we lose our pubs. We lose our cities to a corporate imperialism. And so we come to the essence of his intellectual archaeology by examining Renaissance perspective against the background of the medieval philosophy of light. We can come to understand the ontology of architectural space, which is formed by light before it is structured geometrically. We can see that through two traditions, the Hermetic from ancient Egypt, which Henri Frankfurt, brilliantly fascinating exposition of that Egyptology. Its fascination with early chemistry, for want of a better word, is alchemy, and the light within is a Gnostic idea that all things contain a light that is its truth, its true substance, and that fell to earth from the heavens. That's why gold is such a precious commodity, because it is a piece of fallen light, as is a human spiritually soul. In the Gnostic myth, of course, the earth is a prison in which the soul is trapped until it can return and escape to the goodness of the heavenly realm in the afterlife. That alchemical relationship with light is transformed by perspective, because perspective grows out of optics. But in that progression, the crucial issue is of the participant in architecture, the participant in the temple, or the participant in the city, and particularly the participant in the theatre. The audience is directly addressed across the choir by the poet, while post-perspective proscenium plane, that becomes a perspective illusion. And this phenomena is what both Christian Norberg Schultz and Peter Carl refer to as seeing yourself. Seeing. You are now a spectator, not a participant. And that runs through the transformation of the city in the Serlio's comic set into the tragic. The order of geometry and optics is imposed on your spatial landscape at the expense of your human interaction. In my approach, there is a point where the interpretation, hermeneutics, and the way of making poetics come so close to each other that they become fully reciprocal. And it's just worth noting that hermeneutics, the science of interpretation, if you like, is derived from Hermes, the messenger who is a winged messenger who appears throughout the Hermetic tradition of Hermes Trismegistus and holds in his hand both his caduceus in one and a purse in the other, noting money which is counted, and therefore maths and counting and ultimately number systems and geometry is represented in that purse. The space of experience consists not only of our own accumulated experience and knowledge, but also the experience embodied in previous projects, treaties, books, and buildings, and cities. That the ground of experience is there explicitly and archaeologically. And he likens this slightly rather to the dilemma facing ecologists in the face of climate change. And it's really quite a stark comparison, where for some of us it's absolutely abundantly clear that the obsession with economic growth and producing cars and so forth will kill the planet. It's already doing it. And the answer, therefore, has become electric cars, which still have 4 seats and 1 occupant. I'm still troubled with that one being a motorbiker. It doesn't kind of work for me. We will find no answer in a naive belief that the difficulty can be resolved by subordinating all knowledge and different ways of making to instrumental rationality and technology. Whole areas of reality are not amenable to such treatment, and perpetuating the belief that they are merely deepens the dilemma. Our task to extend personal experience into more public domain of shared reality, where it is possible to communicate not only between different levels of reality, but also between different areas of culture. The aim is to create a continuum of relations, reciprocities, and comprehensible communication that can be succinctly described as communicative space. The framework in which the communicative role of architecture can be restored must make it possible to reconcile the abstract language of conceptual constructions with the metaphorical language of the visible world. This was a typical task of poetics, replaced in modern times by the science of poetics, better known as aesthetics. And here we are, Villa Giulia and this painting show more or less hallucinatory representations, just testifying that realities that are available to us in the natural human world. So that's why he closes with this idea of a fragment, that what remains are small pieces, bits, more than likely around an historic archaeology, whether it's under the ground or still standing, or it's a market. There are many markets in London, Smithfield, where there's an archaeology of activity. Covent Garden was too, but that was gentrified for commercial reasons. But there's usually something under the ground. St Bride's in London is a particularly great example.